Imagine a dystopian future in which a few companies control nearly all access to medication and use this to bar anybody that didn't have mass amounts of wealth from accessing said medication. This future is marked by a government that not only allows this, but actively incentivizes it by withholding aid funding to help equitably spread the medication. This dystopian government further pushes these drugs out of reach by granting renewing monopoly ownership over the drug formation to prevent price competition. This world, in which those granted power over our health abuse that power to extract as much wealth as possible without regard to helping those in the most need, is an unfortunate reality resulting from the utopian desires for power. This desire for power is manifested in wealth accumulation, global ideological hegemony, and political influence. If this is our reality, it begs the question, what really matters? What really matters for the corporations promising to deliver us health care? What really matters for a government that is supposed to maintain the best interest of the people in mind? And what really matters to us as the populace responsible for holding those in power accountable? For nearly all of human history, tuberculosis has been the deadliest infection we have faced. As a species, we have spent much of our time helplessly facing this terrifying reality of a slow, wasting death. Various attempts at curing the disease throughout history proved futile until we discovered the bacteria behind the disease in 1882, allowing our focus to shift onto making antibiotics. This culminated in the 1944 discovery of streptomycin, the first antibiotic against tuberculosis ever synthesized. This was revolutionary. Our greatest disease was suddenly entirely curable. The next 20 years brought rapid discovery and development, allowing an explosion of new medication and treatments to create safe and effective treatments to all tuberculosis. Despite this, today, 80 years after gaining the ability to cure it, there are 1.25 million people annually that die of tuberculosis and 10.8 million annually that fall ill with it. This is clearly a prevalent issue globally, and we have the methods of solving the problem, so why hasn't it been solved? We're going to dive into the two main actors tasked with solving this problem, private health corporations and governments, and analyze their utopian motives to keep this disease around. Specifically, we're going to target one of each and see the role that the U.S. federal government and Johnson & Johnson have played in tuberculosis care globally. Led by a belief that this government has the highest knowledge on what is best for society, and therefore this knowledge must be implemented everywhere, the U.S. federal government has leveraged its position as a provider of global healthcare to require political adherence from other nations. When the U.S. is able to centralize this power, it creates a great utopia for those in power. The utopia created for those in power is great enough that it is not only here to make America great again, but to make everything great again, including making foreign aid great again. If we are led to believe that our way of life is so good, the only good thing, then we are likely to believe that this way of life must be implemented upon everyone in the world for their own good. The federal government, operating under this utopian ideal, has begun to exercise its immense power to control the political ideology of the entire globe, attempting to get other nations to follow in suit with the greatness of America. This is blatant aspects of utopianism. We can see the desire for immense power by the people in charge, allowing them to build their specific idea of a utopia because they can then unilaterally make decisions for the fate of the country and the world. Not only is there desire for power, but then the utopian will to have this power be ubiquitous within society. It can't really be a utopia unless we can make everyone experience the greatness too. As America has been seen as the big brother of the globe for much of modern history, it has seemed our duty to implement this into the global stage. The U.S. federal government has implemented these utopian ideals in clear ways with their policy regarding tuberculosis. Knowing that tuberculosis is an incredible burden around the globe, and that many countries that face high rates of TB are entirely unequipped to deal with the disease on their own and rely on foreign aid, the U.S. has begun to strategically give out aid to increase American hegemony within the globe. For the entire history of curable tuberculosis, the U.S. federal government has been the largest donor of tuberculosis aid in the entire globe. In return for this, the U.S. gets prestige on the global stage, leveraging power over countries that it bestows aid upon, and high priority in global discussions due to its importance globally. This funding is provided through two main avenues historically. directly given to the countries in need through the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, and indirectly distributed to the countries through the Global Fund to End Tuberculosis, HIV, and Malaria, a multinational partnership financing organization that tackles the biggest infectious diseases. Both of these avenues are incredibly important and provide different support and services in regards to ending TB. Despite the evident importance of funding these global initiatives, the United States has recently begun drastically decreasing the amount of aid they give out. In 2025, President Trump abolished USAID, the single largest actor in foreign aid, now defunct. 83% of the programs under the agency were abolished, and the remaining 13% were transferred to the Department of State. This allowed for the disbursement of the measly remainders of money to be granted based on political affiliation rather than based on global need. Shortly after receiving control over foreign aid funds that were formerly controlled by USAID, Secretary of State Marco Rubio published a statement outlining the plans for distributing these funds and the issues he found with prior distribution, namely that on the global stage, the countries that benefit most from our generosity usually fail to reciprocate, and that the USAID had functioned too much as a charity rather than instruments of American foreign policy intended to advance our national interests. Rubio states that a primary issue in this lack of reciprocation was the nations in question's failing to vote alongside U.S. interests in the United Nations. To fix this issue, it was declared that the only foreign assistance programs that would be continued are ones that align with administration policies and which advance American interests. Not only were there restrictions on the types of programs available, but there were immense restrictions on where these programs would be implemented. Rubio stated, "We will favor those nations that have demonstrated both the ability and willingness to help themselves." This rhetoric is spouted with full knowledge that the nations and people in most dire need of this assistance are not ones that are in financial or political positions to offer enticing incentives to the U.S. There is a clear goal of these policy issues, one that Marco Rubio himself stated in the release when he said, "Where there was once a rainbow of unidentifiable logos on life-saving aid, there will now be one recognizable symbol, the American flag." That goal is to have America be unquestionably the biggest and most powerful nation in the globe. Increasing political power and spreading the American greatness over the globe is a direct act in establishing the great American utopia. By requiring nations to adhere to the political will of the United States in order to receive aid funding, we have taken one step forwards in establishing that great American utopia. Many proponents of this increasingly centralized global power often rely on a trickle-down model to justify it, that when we allow people to hoard this power and wealth, they will in turn become charitable and kind and use that power to help those in need. The United States has single-handedly demonstrated the problem with this idea as they continue to exercise apathy over the lives of millions of people across the globe. In addition to the effects of USAID abolition, the U.S. is decreasing its contribution to the Global Fund. The Global Fund is the largest organization in the globe targeting tuberculosis. The Global Fund functions in 3-year cycles, called replenishments, in which the various government and private actors that provide contributions make pledges for the next 3 years. The most recent pledge for the next replenishments were announced in November of 2025. In this, the United States is giving $1.5 billion less than in the last replenishment, cutting a quarter of all the funding they give to the organization. Simultaneously, as the United States government cuts tuberculosis care, the military received an increase of $844 million over Trump's budget request for critical infrastructure. That's $1.1 billion over its prior most recent funding level. This results in the fiscal year 2024 having a budget of $873.5 billion for the military. And this is still increasing, as for the fiscal year 2025, it is projected to have a military budget of $1.1 trillion. Additionally, the budget for ICE was increased from $9 billion in 2024 to $170 billion in 2025. These are incredibly clear priorities at play here. The United States can and will use its considerable resources to maintain its presence as a fear-inducing monopoly on power while actively choosing not to help those it claims to use that power to protect. For tuberculosis globally, the 21st century has been marked by a new fear, that of antibiotic resistance. Despite the mid-20th century having giant leaps in TB care being developed, this research and funding drastically decreased as soon as the treatments proved effective enough to reduce incidence in developed nations. This lack of funding globally caused a situation where many people were exposed to the antibiotics without a follow-through of treatment to completely kill the bacteria, allowing some of the tuberculosis to evolve into drug-resistant tuberculosis. This remained untreatable until Johnson & Johnson released a new drug on the market in 2012, bedaquiline. This was the first medication for drug-resistant tuberculosis to be developed, and it was the first new medication for tuberculosis at all to be developed in over 40 years. This was revolutionary for global health. There finally appeared to be an end in sight for tuberculosis globally. Johnson & Johnson, knowing that the countries that have the highest burden of TB are those at the worst economic positions globally, set the initial pricing for treatment course of this drug on a tiered market of $30,000 for high-income countries, such as the United States, Canada, and Britain, $3,000 for middle-income countries, such as India and China, and $900 for low-income countries, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo and Central African Republic. This pricing was astronomical and made this miracle drug out of reach for many people who needed to access it, oftentimes costing more than people made in an entire year. For example, the average annual income of the Democratic Republic of the Congo is less than $450 annually, and yet Johnson & Johnson charged twice that amount for this necessary drug. Simultaneously, Johnson & Johnson continued to fight to evergreen the numerous patents that they held on bedaquiline, and they largely won this fight. Holding patents on this drug allowed them to hold a monopoly on the price of the drug without competition. Evergreening said patents let them singularly control the price of the drug indefinitely. This caused global outrage. How could a company that claimed to exist to save lives so blatantly prioritize profit over the people? How could they let their own desires for profit outweigh the vast amounts of death that they were causing globally by not letting people access this drug? Global pressure, most of it grassroots campaigning from concerned global citizens, caused Johnson & Johnson to finally cave and lower the cost of the drug a little bit. While this was good, it was recognized that the new price they announced was still astronomically high, and continued global pressure caused a cycle of the drug cost being marginally lowered, the public not being satisfied with the price, and the cost lowering again. This feat of collective pressure on a corporation culminated in Johnson & Johnson settling on a not-for-profit price of $400 for a treatment course, down from the original $3,000 that they were charging. In 2023, the Indian Patent Office denied an attempt at patent evergreening for bedaquiline, allowing generic production to begin, and the entire course of treatment for generic bedaquiline now costs $63 in the countries that it is available in. Following the consistent public pressure and new generic competition, J&J now sells bedaquiline for $130 for the course of treatment. Yet $400 was what they claimed to be their not-for-profit price. Now, I know corporate sympathizers out there are very upset that I have not mentioned that Johnson & Johnson needs to charge this much to make a profit. If the price competition existed for bedaquiline, then Johnson & Johnson wouldn't be able to make a profit. After all, they did invest the money to develop this drug, right? Well, the very same year that the generic competition of bedaquiline started, Johnson & Johnson was clearly so hurt by this loss of revenue. So hurt that their sales rose from $85 billion in 2022 to over $88 billion in 2023. In this same period, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson saw a 117% increase in compensation to $28.4 million a year in 2023. I think it is safe to say that the company did just fine with the competition. Additionally, the claims that the high prices were necessitated by the cost of development were proven false when research into the development funding revealed that public funding paid 5 times as much as Johnson & Johnson did, and Johnson & Johnson's share was only a fraction of what was originally advertised. To this day, in many countries, Johnson & Johnson continues to wield patents on a drug developed largely from public funds to allow them private profit. Maybe let's take a step back, have a timeout, and stop being so harsh on J&J. After all, they deserve some credit for developing this drug at all since no one else was doing it, right? They were motivated by a desire to make the world a better, less tuberculosis-ridden place, and they acted on that motivation to make a life-saving drug. They're honestly heroes in this scenario, right? Wrong. They did it for tax credits and advanced access to US market populations that can pay high prices for other drugs, not for a desire to actually help the state of tuberculosis in the globe. Developing this drug granted Johnson & Johnson access to the orphan drug tax credit, giving them a 50% tax credit on all R&D expenditures. Additionally, for developing this drug, the FDA granted Johnson & Johnson a priority review voucher, a voucher that they can cash in to have the FDA fast-track the review of any of their other products. Johnson & Johnson used this voucher on a psoriasis drug they developed that they sell in the United States for $60,000 per patient per year. This drug brought Johnson & Johnson $3.5 billion in sales, and the priority review voucher provided them a 4-month jump on the market. But Bedaquiline itself meant next to nothing to the corporation. The millions of lives that they have the chance to save with this drug were insignificant when weighed against the billions of dollars they faced to gain by using this drug as a leveraging tool. Johnson & Johnson has demonstrated that they do not care about the health of the globe. They do not care about actually providing life-saving care to eradicate tuberculosis. They care singularly about maintaining profit for those in power, even if it means killing millions in the process. That is what really matters to them. This is the world we live in. These practices are not being hidden from us in the slightest. Our governments and corporations are incredibly clear about what matters to them. The only question that remains is if we, the people, will allow them to establish this utopia they are so keen on developing, or if we will finally recognize the horror of this reality and fight back against it. Vital in this fight is recognizing the sheer amount of power we have as the people. We can vote in or out those who control federal policies. We can exercise our rights to protest and voice our dissent. We can boycott corporations to communicate dissatisfaction with their policies. And we can apply our public pressure until the visibility on these issues is enough for them to change. Through the tale of bedaquiline, we can see that the public holds vast power. We can change the nature of global health when we wield that power properly. Johnson & Johnson continues to hold patents for bedaquiline in many countries, meaning that generic versions are not allowed to be sold and only the highly priced Johnson & Johnson versions of the drug may be sold. One of the single biggest areas of impact we can have is to pressure Johnson & Johnson into dropping their patents everywhere, allowing generic competition to save lives. When we unite, we will eradicate these utopias and establish a more equitable world of health. We will eradicate tuberculosis.